Hello, and thank you for tuning into this event about my book, Stories from a Migrant City. The book went to press before the coronavirus outbreak and the subsequent global pandemic that everyone, in different and unequal ways, is currently affected by. This webinar is taking place at a very challenging and difficult time in the UK and across the world. Many people have died, and many more are ill. Economic hardship is acute. In India, for example, migrant workers are having to go without basic necessities, including food, because their source of income has suddenly dried up. Some politicians there and elsewhere are using the pandemic to demonize particular people and communities. When I revisited the book to prepare for today, I could see that there is some resonance with elements of the pandemic and its effects, both in the UK, where the research that the book draws on was located, and also beyond. I hope that as I read extracts from the book now, this resonance will come through, including the importance to the whole of society of the lives and livelihoods of workers in distribution centres and warehouses, the often harsh working conditions there, the way structures of racism cause division and disadvantage, as well as ways people sometimes come together in adversity and across difference through awareness of what is common to being human. The book was largely written when arguments in England over Brexit used the idea of an out-of-touch cosmopolitan elite to develop an enhanced racial nationalism, often based, whether implicitly or explicitly, on the supposed threat of migrants to long-established local communities. One major argument of the book is that in certain times and places, people are at ease with difference, that there is such thing as a non-elite cosmopolitanism. I will illustrate this shortly when I begin to read from the book with an extract from an interview with a young songwriter, Donna Stevens. A second key intervention is that what might sometimes seem like a clear distinction between people thought of as migrants and others considered locals is in fact more complicated. This insight can be useful in battling stigmatization and division, and the book gets to it through its key method of listening to stories about people's lives, including what is for many a combination of moving and staying put over time. From the beginning of the 2010s, I spent over 8 years during times when I wasn't teaching at the University of Sussex in Brighton, listening to and thinking and writing about the stories of over 100 residents of another small English city, Peterborough, population around 200,000 people, a city that voted to leave the European Union in 2016 by a margin of about 60 to 40. The Peterborough residents' stories are like a lens through which to better understand wider issues about places and how they change, and about the role of migration in that. The extract I will read from Ron Singh's story refers to his memories of multiracial working class conviviality and community, as well as racism, in the area that he grew up in, and his recollection of important changes in Peterborough when the city's new town areas were built. Peterborough has a large warehouse distribution sector, and I will draw on the stories of Agnieszka Kowalczyk-Wojcik, Azra Sabir, and Judita Grublina about the changing conditions of employment in warehouses, especially the increased use of targets and sanctions. We will hear how workers sometimes came together across difference to contest tough management practices. The book also discusses cultural productions emerging from Peterborough in the year of the referendum. As an illustration, I'll read an extract from my discussion of Chris, which profoundly evokes common human experiences of loss, frailty, and mortality. Before I start reading from Stories from a Migrant City, I would like to thank Kaveri Qureshi, a fellow academic now based at the University of Edinburgh, for all the work we did together in the early years of the project. Filmmaker Jay Gearing for our more recent collaboration with warehouse workers. Metal Peterborough, an arts organisation where I was writer in residence during the work with Jay. and all of those Peterborough residents who took part in the research as oral history narrators, whether they chose to be referred to in the book by their real name or a pseudonym. The readings will take another 15 minutes in all. As I read each of the 5 extracts, I'll vary between reading the words of the narrators and my own words. The first passage opens with a short quote from a narrator, Donna Stevens. My song is about the battles that people face in the city, and in general really, all over the world. It's about what I face and other young people as well. The first line is, as I walk on this earth, I start to feel the hurt. So it's like as soon as you get here, you sort of feel the pain and the hurt that people around you face as well as yourself. I try and generalize it so that if it does get released, it helps other people. The poet and rapper Donna Stevens was describing one of her songs to me. A white woman born in Zimbabwe, Donna had lived in London and the English West Midlands before moving to Peterborough with her parents 7 years previously. Donna's global sense of connectedness and her care for other people and for the world were palpable. Her words strongly suggest a cosmopolitan disposition. Yet, in stark contrast to the association frequently made by right-wing media commentators and nationalist politicians, they were not spoken by a member of any elite. At the time of our conversation, Donna was living on benefits, having recently lost her job as a youth support worker at Peterborough City Council. This was, after all, a period of central government austerity following the financial crisis of 2007 and 8 and the subsequent bailout of the banks. Local authorities suffered some of the most drastic spending cuts. Donna couldn't afford the bus fare to the city centre, and in spite of health issues, would walk the 1.5 hours each way instead. A central argument of this book is that a non-elite cosmopolitan disposition and the acts and practices that flow from that should be listened to rather than dismissed. Soon after my conversation with Donna, Kaveri Qureshi and I interviewed another narrator, Peterborough-born Ron Singh. Ron recalled everyday life as a child growing up in Peterborough's Gladstone area in the 1970s. You would walk down the street and first of all, you would smell all the different foods that were coming out. You walked past that house, there'd be saag coming out. Saag just wafted out like that. And then you'd walk past someone else's house and there'd be some Polish food. And then you'd walk past the Marcus Garvey Centre, there'd be Bob Marley playing reggae. And as children, all my friends were like Yugoslavian, Chinese, Italian. We all played football together. So we didn't even know that there was any difference. And I remember thinking that there was no difference between us at all. Everyone got on. There was never any trouble. I remember that the only time there was any trouble was when the National Front decided to march down Cromwell Road. I think they postponed it on the day because there was a lot of people who were just standing on the street saying if they come then we'll see what happens. But I think they didn't come. But that was the only time I can remember any angst. I found out later on that there was this thing, it was called paki bashing. If they were driving round and they saw an Indian guy by himself, they would just jump him. And my dad did get jumped a couple of times. In 1976, when it came to applying to secondary school, Ron's parents were determined to avoid sending him to Eastholme, the school his brother had been to, outside the Gladstone area where they lived, partly because of the relentless racism his brother experienced. So it was decided that he would go to Orton Longville, a recently amalgamated comprehensive school in the Ortons. The Ortons had been selected as the second of 3 new town areas around Peterborough, and they were still under construction when Ron entered secondary school in 1977. Thousands of homes were built in the Ortons in the 70s and 80s to house newcomers to the city, most of whom were white British and from London. Now, I hadn't even heard of Orton Longville School because it was too far to go on my bike, And when we went there, it was a real turn-off, because at the junior school, it was so mixed and so cosmopolitan and everyone was mates. You never had a fight there. You just played football and played with a tennis ball, and it was brilliant. And then my cousin and I went to Orton Longville. It was completely opposite. We were the only Indian kids there. Plus we had turbans on. Plus my name now is Ron, but at school it was Rupinder, so they couldn't even say that name. So it just got changed to something else. I was really small, and I was the youngest. And the worst thing I'll tell you, sometimes parents do things with the best intentions, but they just don't realize what kids are like. Because my uncles are doctors, so we got sent to school with brown leather doctor's briefcases. Ron's recollection of being one of only 2 brown boys in a predominantly white secondary school in the Ortons contrasted with his memories of conviviality at home in Cromwell Road, where his parents at one point established a private cinema. Film songs were part of a rich diversity of music that Ron remembered hearing both at home and in the Gladstone area as he grew up, and which influenced the fusion style of the band Kismet, which he formed with his brothers in the 1990s. I think this is partly where we get our musical diversity from, because my dad loves his Hindi films. But at the same time, my mum would be sitting listening to Elvis, and somehow it's another one of these crazy things. A song would come on. I saw her today, yes, her face was the face I loved. How do I know the words to that song, Needles and Pins? Ron Singh was speaking with us in what I'm referring to as Brexit era England, a time and place of austerity economics, an increasingly restrictionist immigration policy, ever harsher rhetoric about people officially categorized as immigrants, and the ramifications of that rhetoric for the wider racialized group that broad swathes of the white British public regard as immigrants. Ron's story also evokes some of the multiple places elsewhere to which Peterborough residents are connected through migration and music, e.g. London, South Asia, Italy. Such connections are seen to be historically specific. Peterborough underwent dramatic change during the period when its satellite Newtown areas were being constructed. And there is a geography to these changes that is not confined to Peterborough's relation with places beyond the city. The changes occurred unevenly across the contrasting areas within the city, and the relations between these areas mattered too. Like every city, Peterborough was and is a place of places. In the book, one kind of place I've paid particular attention to is the warehouse workplace. Symptomatic of increasingly skewed capital labour relations in the UK after a decade of austerity and nearly 4 decades of neoliberal policies, large corporations involved in logistics in Peterborough operated harsh workplace regimes that involved the regular ratcheting up of performance targets for low-paid agency workers and increasing surveillance of work breaks through digital technology. These were enforced by sanctions. A certain number of breaches, however minor, could lead to dismissal. Workers felt disposable. Companies' determination to drive ever higher levels of added value from each worker was evident from their cavalier approach to induction, training, and health and safety in the workplace. As one former warehouse manager, Sabina, put it in 2017, it is about just getting people in cheap, I would say, cheap work resources. Certain kinds of roles, particularly those involving uncertain numbers of hours or periods of employment, along with low status, low paid, fast paced work, became associated with international rather than British workers. The people employed to work in these roles became racialized as migrants. As elsewhere in England, this was seen as foreigners' work. In order to push people to work at the pace needed, some supervisors used verbal aggression, shouting instructions at workers. Management played on divisions between workers of different national backgrounds. Yet common anger at particular workplace practices could also unite people, even if only momentarily, to contest the divide and rule techniques of racial capitalism, rather than identifying with narrower national or linguistic groups, or allowing themselves to be separated into categories such as white natives, established ethnic minorities, or recent international migrants. In spite of ongoing racisms and racialized hierarchies, the foundations for coming together to take action were sown by the enjoyment some narrators reported of the multi-ethnic, multilingual, multinationality warehouse workplaces. This non-elite cosmopolitan disposition emerged for some through experiences at work. For example, for Agnieszka Kowalczyk-Wojcik, who spoke with me in 2017 about her relations with other workers in a Peterborough warehouse. When I start working at the warehouse, I couldn't imagine that I can spend my off time during the break with people from Malaysia. We have one guy from New Zealand. It's amazing. I can sit with them and speak. I like it. Others, like Laura Klaupeka, Aswa Sabir, and Judita Grublina, also appreciated the mix of people at warehouses where they worked. Laura, who moved to the UK from Poland in 2005, met her South American husband in a Peterborough workplace. Aswa, originally from Iraqi Kurdistan and living in the UK since 2002, spoke of his experience working in a warehouse with Polish, Lithuanian, Latvian, Bulgarian and Romanian colleagues, and the friendships he and his wife, working at the same warehouse, developed with people of other nationalities there. There were so many different communities. Sometimes we sit with English people as well. Honestly, it does all depend on individuals. Some of the English people, I still have friendships with them. Judita, who moved to Peterborough from Lithuania in 2009, described a specific moment of resistance where she combined with Turkish, Latvian and other Lithuanian colleagues to challenge what they had experienced as nationality-based discrimination. Like Laura, her broad employment experience before and after working in a warehouse enabled her to reflect on the specific opportunities such workplaces presented for communicating with others across difference and for sharing stories. Another way of sharing Peterborough residents' stories that I discuss in Stories from a Migrant City is via books by Peterborough-based authors. Friendship is a major theme of Chris Porsche's remarkable book, Reunions, which uses photography almost entirely located in Peterborough to capture emotional, visual, and visceral experiences of time passing. Porsche, now in his 60s, has a day job as a paramedic and describes himself as an amateur photographer, and through his regular paramedic paparazzi column in the Peterborough Telegraph, has become a unique and well-known contributor to the life of the city. Reunions involved bringing together friends, relatives, and strangers whom Porsche originally shot in the city in the early 1980s, to be photographed again, mostly in the same locations and poses, some 35 years later. Some of the reunion photographs are reunions not of two or more photographic subjects, but reunions between a single subject and Porsche himself. Many, though not all, of the original photographs in reunions are in black and white, and most were taken in the era of Margaret Thatcher's premiership, a period of intensified neoliberal economic and fiscal policies, deindustrialization, and a concerted government effort to crush trade union power. Two of the photographs capture demonstrations against the effects of Thatcher's policies, including cuts to education and social services budgets and low pay for nurses, while a third pictures a picket line during a strike at a water sewage works. The move from black and white to colour between time periods is striking as our peoples changed physical appearances. Along the way, they reveal part of the history of international migration to Peterborough over the period, with textual and/or visual references to an Italian grocery shop, butcher's shop, and stovetop coffee maker, and a Sikh temple in a terraced house. There is an unstated working class pride in the photographs. Evidence of spatial mobility emerges from the words that run alongside the photographs, put together by the journalist Joe Riley via interviews with the subjects. These convey a toing and froing, as well as longer-term residential moves around the UK and internationally, to places such as Halifax in Yorkshire, Hong Kong, Bristol, Aberdeen, Australia, Essex, Spalding, Colorado, Kings Lynn, London, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. Porsche portrays a working-class culture that is both multi-ethnic and non-metropolitan, giving the lie to the conceptual dichotomy of contemporary debates that pit a beleaguered white working class against a cosmopolitan liberal elite. The use of the same pose and site for each pair of photographs, with a gap in time that is in most cases over 3 decades, means that some of the original subjects are missing. If one of the original subjects died between the photographs, the name of the deceased person is given, and in some of the reunion photographs, a friend or family member replaces them in tribute, especially if the person died young. This all adds to the emotionality of Porsche's reunions and its evocation of human frailty and mortality, as well as the joy of reunion and the playfulness of trying to restage an old photograph. The 4 Peterborough books discussed in Stories from a Migrant City positively reflect the city's migrant heritage, while also respecting people who have never or only very rarely moved residence. These books, together with the biographical oral histories I quote from throughout, are part of Peterborough's gift to the rest of the UK and to the world. Collectively, through their portrayal of universal human experiences of loss, absence, and death, they provide a vision of common humanity and thus make their own contribution, however small, to preparing the ground for future struggles against all forms of racism, class and gender inequalities, workplace exploitation, and climate injustice. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Ben. I thought that was brilliant. I thought the extracts you chose were very good, and it's such a great talk. I have a number of questions I was going to ask, but a number of questions have come in from the audience, which were very similar to my own, so I don't want to deprive them. So I don't know if you want to look at the questions that have come in, Ben.
Sure. I'm having a look now. I'm just opening the first one.
Sure.
So the first one asks, what made me choose Peterborough as the place to shed light on these issues? It's a complex story, but I applied for a research grant that was specifically intended to lead to a study on Peterborough, a 2-year study involving long-term residential fieldwork and oral history, which I designed myself, and it was a national competition. And I'd been drawn to the city because I'd previously done research in Norwich, which is at the other end of East Anglia, and I'd also done work with people who are working in food factories in the Fens just outside Peterborough, but actually lived in Peterborough. So there were many reasons why I was attracted to apply for that grant in 2010. I was also inspired by some of the activist and anti-racist organisations in Peterborough and the organisations there that were providing a welcome to new arrivals, international migrants, like the organisation New Link that I write about elsewhere in the book. So there's, that's followed by a national question from about the pandemic. So I'm reading it as I speak. So the question is, what difference do you think the pandemic will make to nationalist attitudes, given our widespread acclaim for NHS workers, many of whom are BAME? What difference might this make? Well, I've been reading quite a lot of other people's work about this and trying to think about it myself, and also being horrified at the number of deaths overall, but also by the hugely disproportionate number of deaths of Black and minority ethnic people in the UK. And I'm also really beyond outraged by the way some governments are pinning the pandemic on certain groups. So I think there is a real danger that the pandemic will be used to increase racism, to increase certain forms of nativism and nationalism. But your question also rightly alludes to the acclaim that key workers, including NHS workers, are receiving. And I was reading today a blog by a colleague of mine called Gurminder Bamra in an online magazine called Discover Society, who's made exactly this point, that given how much acclaim there is for key workers and the fact that a high proportion of those workers are either Black and minority ethnic or recent international migrants, that maybe this could make a difference in a more positive direction. So the next question I can see says that I mentioned some similarities between the subject matter of the book and the global pandemic. Could I expand on that? I think I've done that in the answer to the last question, but I think that the book focuses on divisions and racism, and so the element to which the pandemic is playing out and showing the effects of racism through these disproportionate death rates is a connection. But there are other connections, such as the way the book evokes the lives of key workers working in the food supply chain, not just in warehouses, but also in agriculture and in food factories, and values in ways that society often hasn't done prior to the pandemic, the role of key workers. And also the book has in it the capacity, shows the capacity for people to come together across difference. And this is something that has been happening at the local level in various parts of the UK and in other countries. So those are some of the ways that I think that there are connections. So the next question is about the concept of cosmopolitanism. Why has cosmopolitanism been seen as elite? What work does it do to use the concept of cosmopolitanism in researching non-elite lives? So why cosmopolitanism? Many thanks. So this question is really interesting, and I'm aware that there are not just bookshelves but libraries about the concept of cosmopolitanism. It's a widely discussed concept in social sciences, in philosophy, and my book is not really about the concept. However, what it does do is it connects with a political debate where the positive of a multiracial society was being pushed aside by often quite elite people who were dismissing multiculturalism as an elite project and not connecting with the ordinary cosmopolitanism that everyday life often had in it for people in some parts of the UK, whether in colleges or in workplaces, all the time in relation to ongoing racisms. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact, and I do in the introduction to the book, that cosmopolitanism has been used itself, the concept has been used in an elite way, in a kind of, as it were, imposed, and sometimes it's denied. In the way it's been used, it's denied underlying class inequality, it's denied underlying racisms. But I think the way I'm addressing the concept is really to speak into the current political debate, and the one that was particularly strong at the time of the Brexit referendum and a couple of years after that. So the next question asks, did you find that places like the warehouse were transformative and generative, in that being in these places actively moved the non-elite actors at the heart of your book to become more cosmopolitan? Or were they bringing a pre-existing cosmopolitanism into these places and adapting that to their experiences? It's a difficult question, and I think the reason it's difficult is because the answer is probably both. But some of the people that I spoke with who spoke about their experiences in warehouses, but also in food factories near Peterborough, these stories evoked a surprise at how much they enjoyed. People enjoyed a multi-ethnic, multinational workforce, and also how sometimes friendships were formed in ways that people hadn't necessarily expected. It would depend on people's own life stories, where they'd lived, whether they'd lived in an area that was already quite mixed with lots of everyday multicultural and were coming to the workplace from that, or whether they'd lived in more of a monocultural place. So I think the places, the workplaces that I was looking at were in some ways transformative and brought about some element of cosmopolitan disposition, but they were also building on that on an element of cosmopolitan disposition that people brought with them. So moving on to the next question. The question is, hi Ben, you described the way employers used racial capitalism as a divisive technique of labour control in the warehouses. Can you give a little more detail on this? Along what lines was this deployed? Which divisions did employers attempt to activate? And was this fairly static or relatively fluid, with certain groups being situated together by employers at some moments and opposed to each other at others? Also, how did this interplay with other intersections such as gender? Thank you for that question. In the book, what I didn't do in the reading, but I do in the introduction and more in the chapter about workplaces, is I've discussed some of the existing academic literature on racial capitalism and what it means. There's a vast literature on this, including the work of Cedric Robinson and also Gargi Bhattacharya and many others. And it's used in different ways. But the way I used it was really influenced by the work of a historian called David Roediger. And this is looking at it as a way of creating divisions within a workforce, creating the idea of divisions, creating the idea that certain categories deserved slightly better conditions, better terms than others, in order to create and maintain divisions along lines of race. And it builds on some of the ideas of W.B. Du Bois as well, about white workers and black workers. And it's interesting when you look at some of the literature that's been written more recently. Gargi herself in her book talks about how gender is also used, which you mentioned, as a way of dividing the workforce, and that capitalism is not necessarily and always racialized in its employment practices. So in some ways it's a more nuanced reality than the term itself may have implied in the extract I read. Thank you for that. So the next question is, thank you for this interesting talk. I wonder about how the non-elite cosmopolitan disposition that you write about differs for different groups coming from different social classes. For instance, how is it for the people who, like many Central Europeans, experience downward social mobility in spite of sometimes higher education, work in badly paid jobs? That's really interesting. And one of the concepts that I thought about in writing the book was about the idea of the factory worker, and the idea about a factory worker being a working class person and a certain image of a certain level of education, a certain kind of housing tenure, an experience of life. And talking to people about their whole lives brought out here a much more complicated picture, so that it wasn't just Central Europeans that this questioner is asking about, who might have experienced what's considered to be a higher occupation, then a lower occupation, then a higher occupation. But people more generally, and because of the structures of racism and the xenophobia that are used in workplaces and occur in workplaces even when they're not used instrumentally, it's often harder for that mobility, to the social mobility that you're referring to be experienced by Black and minority ethnic people and more recent immigrants. So there is a lot of need to distinguish between the experience of different people, and you're quite right to ask that question. So moving to the next question, do you think the opinions you described of warehouse workers being cheap or disposable will shift given our reliance on them during the pandemic? Thank you for that. I really hope so. In the UK, there is a notable shift, I think, in the way that key workers in general are talked about, because people across society as a whole realize their dependence on key workers, including people working in the food chain, including people who pack packages in large warehouse distribution centres, and I think and postal workers, and the risks that people are taking, the risks of catching the virus, because people are working. Sometimes large corporations that are making huge profits are not allowing people to distance safely at work, and this is a scandalous issue which I think people are more exercised about. I can only hazard a guess at that, but I certainly hope so. So the next question is, how did Ron Singh understand the racism experienced by his brother? Was he shielded from this? Thank you for that question. We'd have to ask Ron, and he was intending to register for this webinar. But if I was just to say a bit more, when I selected that extract, I cut out other stories from what Ron had told me that are included in the book. And for example, he recalled being taken by his school teacher, primary school teacher, to a football match with his class. Actually, they were taken all the way from Peterborough to Norwich for the match to see Norwich City. And he heard racial abuse being shouted towards his class, and he didn't actually think it was being shouted at him, but it was another kind of racism that he encountered, and there were others. So the racism that his brother encountered at Eastholme wouldn't have been news to him. And in fact, other people that I interviewed during the study also spoke about racism in the 1970s at secondary schools. And there is a wider social science literature on this as well. Now going to the next question. So it says, I was wondering if this now completes the stories you want to tell, or can we expect to read more from you? Oh, that's very kind. I, of course, would love to keep writing. I think there's a question about what kind of involvement any human being who is well and who has enough to eat and good housing is going to have in the current crisis, and whether that's for writers to keep writing or to be involved in other ways. I'm very involved in university teaching at the moment through online teaching, and students are going through horrendous upheavals. It's very difficult for students, and it's also challenging to develop that teaching. So the answer is I would like to write more, and there are a couple of other writings coming out in the coming year. One of them is an edited book, which I'm really hoping will be out towards the end of the year, written with colleagues on a large project called Creative Interruptions, which some of the research for stories from a migrant city was also part of. Thank you. So the next question says, does the cosmopolitanism you found get reflected in Brexit votes from Peterborough? I worry that there is sometimes a disconnect between the personal, including work experience, and how people make political decisions. Is the lie you expose of dichotomy between supposed cosmopolitan elite and the nativism of the working class backed up by Brexit data? Well, that's a very good question as well, like all of them. And there's some useful material there in the blog that Gurminder Bumrah wrote that I referred to at the beginning, that came out yesterday in Discover Society, where she uses some of her earlier writings to reinforce the point that some of the vote to leave the European Union, an important fraction of that vote came from white middle-class people in the south of England. So the way that people are categorized in terms of how they voted is something that needs proper scrutiny. Also, it's very important to distinguish between the campaigns, both of which, both the Leave campaign and the Remain campaign, were very divisive and problematical. And the people who voted, whether they voted for Leave or Remain, and the complex reasons that they may have voted for either of those options. Peterborough is a complex place, and it defies stereotype. The city did vote Leave 60-40, and 1 year later, in the 2017 general election, it elected a black woman as a Labour MP, and then another year later, 2 years later, in a by-election, a white woman won for Labour, a very tightly fought by-election, and then a white man was elected for the Conservatives in December 2019. So I wouldn't want to try to hazard a guess about the reasons why people voted, but it's certainly the case that you can't read a person's vote from their class or their ethnicity. It's a lot more complex than that, and I do believe that everyday life experience plays a part, but so do those big narratives developed in the media as well that affect all of us, including the narrative of the cosmopolitan elite. So the next two questions are from people who've already asked questions, which is lovely. So I'm going to look at the first one. This is, were there surprising findings? What was surprising to you that you uncovered in the course of your research? Well, I never thought I'd write a chapter about other people's books. I've written book reviews before, but I was so, I just brought to life by the books that I read in 2016. They were all published around the same time. The one I mentioned by Chris Porsche is also Parveen Ashraf's Parveen the Spice Queen, which is a cookbook, a book by Jesse Brennan, which full disclosure, I have to say I've got a small piece in that one, which is about the Green Backyard, which is a community environmental initiative in Peterborough, and also a book called Being Christina, which is the life story of a Holocaust survivor who spent most of her life in Peterborough and brought up her children as Catholic, and only revealed at the very end of her life that she was in fact Jewish and had lost close family members in the Holocaust. And these books together spoke volumes about the positive elements of migration and everyday multiculture in the city.